One more note, just before I get started, please don't forget to support where you worship. It is our obligation as the people of God, it is our obligation as members of Second Church of God to make sure that we support where we worship. Please, ma'am, please, sir, always not forget about the Lord, because remember, it is the Lord that brought us over, and he also commands us to pay our tithes and our offerings. So, having said that, we're going to jump into the Word of God. Also, don't forget, if you have problems concerning GiveLify or giving in and of itself, and you may have cash and you may not want to deal with GiveLify, make sure you reach out to Brother Tony White, and he'll lead and guide you in the right direction in which you need to go in. Okay? All right, let's jump into the Word of God. Very, very excited, very excited over what the Lord is about to do. Again, we thank Lady Key for last week for her message. It was an awesome message. She gave a dynamic word, but we're going to move forward from here. I had one thing planned, but then the Lord switched it up in the middle of it, and I think this was the reason why also that we had something. So I believe that it was something more that the Lord needed you to hear during this time right here. Now, troubled times will present itself. Troubled times will present themselves at various times in our lives. In various times in our lives, we'll have troubled times. I would have to say that the time in which we live in right now is one of those times. A time which we don't even have to look very far. We don't have to search for troubled times very far. But we can look around the corner. We can listen to the news at night. We can see what's going on right before our eyes. We can see what's going on overseas. We're in troubled times. And oftentimes when troubled times present itself, we tend to stress. We tend to sometimes become very, very frantic. I would even have to say that the reason that we do lose it, the reason that we do become frantic, the reason why we do oftentimes become stressed out throughout troubled times is because of a lack of faith, but an abundance of fear. Abundance of fear will cause us to become frantic. Abundance of fear will cause us to be stressed out. But God, the thing that we must remember is that God never sanctioned, God never approved of his people operating in fear. He never did. There's nowhere in the Word of God that you can find for me that will show us that God approves of us in fright or in fear of other things other than himself. And then that fear of God is more so of respect of God and not a fright of God. 2 Timothy, the first chapter and the 7th verse says it this way. It says, "For God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power, love, and of a sound mind." Having said that, I want to use for a topic for this morning, just for a few moments, because I'm not going to be long, just for a few moments, I want to use for a topic, trusting God in troubled times. Trusting God in troubled times. We must reconcile that even with this tough virus going around, even with the stressors of running to your grocery store and nothing is on the shelf, even in dealing with do I touch this, or do I buy some gloves, or there's no face masks around, and there's all these things going on. And what do I do? And am I around somebody? Am I too close to other people? Even in dealing with that, we must still understand that God is still God. He's the same yesterday, today, and forevermore. Now let's look at our text for this morning. Our text is going to be out of Psalms, the 46th chapter, Psalms 46. I'm going to give you a moment to get it. Again, that's Psalms 46. And while I pull it up here, let me make sure I open it up make it large enough so I can see it. Okay, Psalms 46 reads, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, even though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea. Though its waters roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with its swelling, Selah. Verse 4 says, there is a mountain whose streams shall make glad the city of God, the holy place of the tabernacle of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God shall help her just at the break of dawn. I'm getting kind of excited about this because I was doing some studying and it was pretty exciting to me. Where was I at? Verse 5. Verse 5 says, God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God shall help her just at the break of dawn. Verse 6. The nations raged. The kingdoms were moved. He uttered his voice and the earth melted. Verse 7. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Selah. Verse 8 through 11 says this, come behold the works of the Lord, who has made desolations in the earth. He makes wars cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bows and cuts the spears in two. He burns the chariot in the fire. Verse 10 and 11. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. Final verse, verse 11. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Selah. I don't know about you, but that was a refreshing passage of scripture. When we look at the text, we notice that the text is broken down. Psalms 46 is broken into three major sections. Section 1 is God's protection. Section 2 is God's presence. And section 3 is God's preeminence. So again, the first section is verses 1 through 3. That's God's protection. This is all it is talking about. Remember before, I told you one time before that when we begin to study the Word of God, if we can break it down into bite-sized chunks, then we can understand it a little bit better. The whole overarching text is talking about trusting God in troubled times. But when you begin to break down verse 1 through 3, you see God's protection. When you break down verses 4 through 7, we begin to see God's presence. When we begin to break down section 3, verses 8 through 11, we see God's preeminence. Let's begin to exegete the text a little bit. Let's look at the text. When we begin to look at verse 1, verse 1 says, God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in troubled times. When we look and consider this text, or when we look and consider the text in general, many of the other Psalms begin with a description of the psalmist's crisis. So when on normal occasions, when you begin to read a text inside of the book of Psalms, you begin to see that the psalmist is presenting a problem. The psalmist is presenting a crisis. And that's how you know what the rest of the text is talking about. But when we look at Psalms 46, it's not that way. Psalms 46 begins with a solution, not the problem. Psalms 46 says God is our refuge and strength. It doesn't start off with there's a problem, there's an issue going on, but it starts out with God being our refuge and strength. It starts off with saying that God is our solution to whatever in life is going on in our lives. He said God is our refuge and our strength. God is a safe place for the believer. So I don't care what's going on in our lives, God is our safe place. I don't care what in the world is happening in our lives. I don't care how many viruses come out, but God is our safe place. He is our protection. He is our shelter. Say, God is our refuge. God is our strength. He said he's a very present help in troubled times. The psalmist here is driving home the fact that we, the people of God, his people, are weak and vulnerable at times. He said, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in troubled times. He then begins to notice or helps us to understand that there will be times when we are troubled. There will be times when we become weak. There will be times when we become vulnerable to the things around us. Life may throw us some cards that we're dealt with that are just not right at times to us, to our thinking. But he says, even in this, God will be your refuge. God will be your strength. There are many different ways in our lives and instances in our lives when we become weak and vulnerable. To name a few, times when you get hurt by somebody, you become weak and you become vulnerable. Times when the government may throw something out here that you have absolutely no control over. That's times when you become weak and you become vulnerable. Let's say somebody rolls up on you in the dark while you're walking to your car, walking from your car, and they got a hood on their head or whatever the case may be. That's the time when we become weak and times when we become vulnerable. So there are instances in our lives where we become weak and we become vulnerable, but God has never changed. He has never ceased to be our refuge, our place of protection, and our strength. The psalmist wasn't speaking from a place of indoctrination. The psalmist wasn't speaking from a place of where somebody taught him that God was their refuge, his refuge and his strength. But the psalmist was speaking from a place of experience, understanding that regardless of what happens in my life, God will be my refuge and my strength. He said God is a very present help. That means that God is always there. A very present